What I want to talk about is in the title. The United Nations just had its 74th General Assembly, and part of that discussion was around the Sustainable Development Goals that were set out in 2015. As you can see, this is a list of ambitions that the UN had set for itself for achievement by 2030. On some of these goals, there is progress, although not success expected by 2030 as of yet. For example, ending poverty. This is a major and obvious goal that the entire world should be able to accomplish. And as you can see, the poverty rate in the world has decreased dramatically. A very large part of that, the majority of that, in fact, is due to the great achievements of China over particularly the past 40 years. However, the world is not on track to end poverty by 2030. Another aspect of the Sustainable Development Goals is health. As you can see here, well-being has improved over the past decades. Infant mortality, deaths of those under 5 has dropped nearly in half over the last 2 decades. That's very good. Still, 5 million young people dying every year is something that we should be able to avoid entirely. You can see how technology has improved things. You can see the number of deaths of measles that have been averted due to vaccination. However, not everybody at the United Nations was happy with the success being achieved.
People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
So there were some views expressed at the UN about the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to take this one up in particular and look at these some of these claims that were made, not only by this young person here. Let's take a look at extinctions. People may have heard that extinctions are on the rise, and we hear these kinds of general things without any numbers all the time. Extinctions are up, we're going to lose all of life, ecosystems are gone, ecosystems are challenged. Well, it's just not true. If we look at known species extinctions, compiled here by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is in charge of making these categorizations, it's not going up, it's going down. Let's take a look at extreme weather. Here you see a chart of cyclone frequency, the number of tropical cyclones over the past, how long is this? Half a century, not increasing. Major hurricane frequency, we're not seeing the claims that supposedly are threatening us. And if we look at other aspects of this, people, I think about a month ago, 2 months ago, were very concerned about the Amazon, which was called the lungs of the earth, whatever that means. And a proposal was made that this has to be an international issue. We have got to defend the Amazon rainforest. The earth is being destroyed. It's probably related to climate change somehow. Well, take a look outside the context of 2019 having more fires in the Amazon than 2018. Over a longer period of time, no, 2019 was not a year of particularly high fires in the Amazon. In fact, it's lower than a decade ago. Why? Because of development. Using fire to clear land isn't a very good way of doing it. Tractors are much better, equipment is much better, and this industrialization has led to the reduction of using fire, which is very old. Let's talk about development overall. 100 years ago, every year, 500,000 people died due to various types of extreme weather events. Hurricanes, this sort of thing. 500,000 people every year, about a century ago. Today, fewer than 10% that many perish on average. So actual deaths due to extreme weather are way down. Is it because the weather got better? I'm not saying that, but what is our exposure to the weather? As you have more development, how much is your life directly impacted by extreme weather versus what kind of protection do you as a person and your society have as a whole? We should keep that in mind. But it's possible that I'm missing something here because there are many calls to action, some of them very urgent, some of them almost strident. Here, for example, is Mustafa Tolba. He's the executive director of the UN Environmental Program, and he says, the world faces an ecological disaster as final as nuclear war unless governments act now. Without action, the future will bring, by the turn of the century, an environmental catastrophe which will witness devastation as complete, as irreversible as any nuclear holocaust. That's a scary assessment, isn't it? I don't know if people heard when he made this assessment. It was on May 11th in 1982. Now, well, that didn't quite happen. Maybe he was an outlier. Noah Brown, the New York director of the UN Environmental Program. A senior UN environmental official says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed within 12 years. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees threatening political crisis. I'm sure people have heard about this, right? Okay, 1989. 2007, the chief of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. If there's no action before 2012, it's too late. What we do in the next 2 to 3 years will determine our future. This is the defining moment. Okay, well, 2012 already happened, right? So I guess we're doomed. Prince Charles, lovely fellow, we'll hear more about him. This is clearly a person who's in touch with the poor people of the world. In March of 2009, he said that we have less than 100 months to alter our behavior before we risk catastrophic climate change. We may yet be able to prevail. Take heart, and thereby avoid bequeathing a poisoned chalice to our children and grandchildren. I told you he was in touch. But we have only 100 months left. When is 100 months after March 2009? Anybody quick with their numbers? It already happened, right? The grim reality is that our planet has reached a point of crisis and we have only 7 years before we lose the levers of control. Adjusting his calculations a bit, that's okay. 2010, ladies and gentlemen, we have only 86 months left before we reach the tipping point. 2014, we are running out of time. How many times have I found myself saying this over recent years? 2015, His Royal Highness warns that we have just 35 years to save the planet from catastrophic climate change. 2019, at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, where leaders of powerful countries around the world nonetheless debase themselves by going to a meeting with the Queen, who wears a crown and has a big mace in front for their group picture to remind people what happens if they get out of line. Prince Charles spoke to these nations of the world saying, I am firmly of the view that the next 18 months, will decide our ability to keep climate change to survivable levels and to restore nature to the equilibrium we need for our survival. Now, these are not well, the head of the IPCC is a little bit more of a scientist. Clearly, Prince Charles is not what anybody would consider a scientist, and maybe I'm just picking on people who are political figures who say wild things all the time. We know that happens, right? So let's take a moment and maybe we should actually look into the facts of the matter here. We hear frequently that the science is settled. The science is settled. That 97% of people in some not terribly well-known sample all agree with some statement about which we aren't given precision. That global warming is actually occurring, that it's a catastrophic emergency, that we have 18.2 months left. What does that 97% mean? And more importantly, is anything true because a lot of people think it? Okay, so I would say if you're having a scientific discussion, you're trying to figure out the facts of something, what most matters is whether it's true or not, whether many people believe it, or whether you hear that many people believe it. Let's take a look. Now, the models, they don't work. So these were models of temperature, and extrapolating, you can see here the chart going up, is expected temperatures that did not anticipate the pause in global warming, the pause in temperature increase that occurred for a decade and a half. You can see the temperatures pausing there on the bottom. Here's another image of this using satellite data, which doesn't involve the kinds of adjustments that ground measurements entail. From 97 to 2015, where did the warming go? The CO2 definitely continued to increase. Now, there were explanations of this after it occurred. The models were recalibrated and so forth. But if it wasn't predicted in advance, it stands to reason that it's possible that models about how the entire Earth works may not be as perfected as they are sometimes claimed to be. Let's take a look at CO2 and temperature. This, when I saw that that science fiction movie Al Gore made called An Inconvenient Truth, he had a big chart of this, right? He showed over a long period of time a connection between CO2 and temperature. I don't know if people remember having seen that movie or if you were forced to in school. He says, look, these go together, CO2 and temperature. Okay, two things going and moving together doesn't mean that one caused the other, or that you can say which one caused the other. In this case, is there temperature changes that then change the amount of CO2, say by changing the solubility of CO2 in the oceans? Is CO2 being changed by some independent process over hundreds of thousands of years, which then guides the temperature? Or is something else happening that has effects on both? Well, it's a little bit hard to tell. But one thing we can do is if we zoom in and get a better spatial resolution on this, you can see on the lower part of this slide, if we compare when, let's say, temperature reaches a peak to where the CO2 peaks, well, gosh, the temperature is reaching these local peaks before the CO2 does, suggesting that the CO2 follows temperature. Not conclusive, but certainly not conclusive proof that because of this, CO2 is the thermostat adjuster on our temperature. As a matter of fact, the way that past temperatures are even presented has been altered. In 1990, if you picked up a copy of the IPCC report and wanted to have a look at it, you would have seen the graph on the left of past temperature over the last millennium, including a medieval warm period, when wine was grown far north of where is possible today, the Little Ice Age, where there were freezings of rivers, crop failures, very bad for the economy. In 2001, this was ironed out to make the claim that recent temperature changes were more dramatic than anything that has ever occurred, that we're seeing temperatures zoom upwards. Well, what's the data that this is based on? Because measurements from ground thermometers have various local impacts that could affect them. Say changes in land use near the temperature recording station, or the replacement of one thermometer by an entirely new one. You've changed your apparatus. You do have to do some kinds of calibrations when you've got overlapping data sets and you have to sort of pull them together. Let's look at how those calibrations occur, adjustments as they're called. In 1999, the temperature in 1999 was presented as being about a half a degree cooler than the peak that was reached in 1935. You can see that on the left. So here we get our high temperature in the 1930, I forget the year, it was in the early 30s. A decrease to the 99 level. When the same temperature record was presented in 2006, we discovered, no, actually the temperature had risen between the 30s and 1999. It's still talking about 1999. This is one example. Overall, this chart shows the trend of the adjustments that were made to past temperature records. Adjustments made to the temperatures actually recorded by apparatus. There's a very clear trend here. In the first half of the 20th century, the adjustments are almost uniformly downwards. So, oh no, it's actually a little bit cooler. And then in the second half, they're almost uniformly upwards. So, oh, it's actually a little bit warmer. The lower two panels show for a specific time period. They're a little bit hard to see. This is a 5-year time period. And over that 5-year time period, you can see how the adjustment value itself was adjusted from 2008 to 2013. So the cooler temperature said, no, it was actually a little bit cooler, and then the warmer temperature is adjusted to be a little bit warmer. So this is proof that there is man-made global warming. It's right here. It's right here. Let's talk about other things that affect the climate, because believe it or not, CO2 is not the only thing that affects life on the Earth. The sun is very important, for example. The orbit of the Earth is very important, and even the galaxy and our motion through it is very important. So on the long scale of what causes climate changes, well, changes in the eccentricity of the orbit of the Earth, that is, how much our motion around the sun resembles a circle versus more squeezed out like an ellipse. This is the cause of the long-term ice age cycles that we see. If we look at something on a shorter time period, we see, this is a chart over a 25-year period, a correlation between, in red, the flux of cosmic rays coming to the Earth, and in blue, low-level cloud cover. Cosmic rays are charged particles moving very fast that are coming from somewhere else in our own galaxy, maybe even beyond. They're coming towards the Earth. As the previous speaker had mentioned, because the Earth has a magnetic field, not all of this stuff actually ends up reaching the Earth. Some of it gets deflected, some of it gets through. The strength of that Earth's magnetic field and the impact of the sun's magnetic field on our own can have a modulating factor on the intensity of cosmic radiation reaching us. If there's more clouds, more light is reflected. Overall, this can lower temperature. So if we compare directly tropospheric temperature with cosmic radiation, we see some very strong correlations. And by using reconstructions in the past of cosmic radiation through such things as looking at meteorites or other evidence, we're able to reconstruct in a rough way some connections between this much larger process involving the galaxy and the sun on our temperature. Now, is this the whole story? I'm not saying this is the whole story, but if this does not enter into models of the Earth's climate, when it's clearly something that bears study and seems to have a very strong impact, how much faith can you put in those models? Yeah, so in terms of why this might be related, actually we don't really have time for that, so we'll skip it. There's a wonderful research being done on this at CERN, where artificial cosmic rays are being created in their apparatus there to try to create cloud condensation nuclei. Okay, I'll say it. Water molecules are very small. They don't like to necessarily stick together to form a raindrop unless you got something big enough for them to stick to, a condensation nucleus. If you've got stuff that's too small to serve this role and it gets ionized by cosmic radiation in a way that it ends up sticking together or moving about in regards to that, this is a proposed mechanism for why cosmic radiation would be connected to clouds and temperature. Anyway, the science certainly isn't settled. Is it possible that CO2 has an impact on the temperature? Certainly. I think that's a reasonable thing to study, and I think there's evidence that there is an impact. How big is that impact? How certain are we about that impact? And then what we're going to be getting into next, how costly are the proposals made to avert this impact? Every one of those is something that's worth thinking about and not turned into a yes or no, are you a denier or not? Okay, let's take a slight detour to look at the modern environmentalist movement. Clean air, clean water, they're great. That's not the only reason environmentalism was created in the late 1960s, at the time that many nations around the world had achieved, through fights, their independence. And some people in Europe weren't all that happy about this independence. So the founders of the environmentalist movement, the World Wildlife Fund, Sir Julian Huxley, he has a very interesting pedigree. He was the vice president of the British Eugenics Society. Does everybody know what eugenics is? Race science. Okay. The study of, supposedly scientific racism. He promoted eugenics as the first director of UNESCO, and he continued to serve as president of the British Eugenics Society even after World War II, when most people realized that this really wasn't a very good idea. And then he said he helped create the World Wildlife Fund. Prince Bernhard, the Nazi. He was a member of the Nazi SS. He resigned from the Nazi party in order to marry the future Queen of the Netherlands, and he signed his resignation letter, Heil Hitler, obviously indicating that he didn't really have a turn of heart so much as seeking political gains. He then went on as director of KLM Airlines to help ferry Nazis out of Germany at the close of World War II to escape prosecution. He also helped create the World Wildlife Fund, very sweet guy. Prince Philip, who also helped create the World Wildlife Fund, said, "I was in Sri Lanka recently, where a United Nations project set out in the late 1940s to eradicate malaria. It's an island, and it was therefore possible to destroy the mosquito carrying the disease. What people didn't realize was that malaria was actually controlling the growth of the population. The consequence was that within about 20 years, the population doubled. Now they've got to find something for all of those people to do, and some way to feed them." Later, human population growth is probably the single most serious long-term threat to survival. Yes, people existing is bad for people's survival. We're in for a major disaster if it isn't curbed, not just for the natural world, but for the human world. The more people there are, the more resources they'll consume, the more pollution they'll create, the more fighting they will do. We have no option. If it is not controlled voluntarily, it will be controlled involuntarily by an increase in disease, starvation, and war. You might not want to have this guy as your neighbor. So it's population reduction. It's the prevention of development. This has been a goal of this movement from its creation because that was the reason for its existence. Again, I differentiate this from actual concerns about having water that's safe to swim in, air that's good for your lungs, etc. Those are legitimate concerns. The creation of parks all across Africa, sucking up sovereign areas, particularly on border areas, to allow the motion across those borders that those countries might not like. This is the kind of thing the World Wildlife Fund really got into. And today, this is promoted not by, people say this is socialist, trying to take over all your freedom. Well, I'm sorry, Wall Street, the City of London, the Bank of England, the Banque de France, these people are all big on promoting green finance right now. They're all big on this. Now, let's take a look at another complaint from a famous person.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth.
Talk about tone deaf. Okay, so we were talking earlier about the 5 million young people that die every year in the world. There are 1 billion people on this planet without reliable access to electricity. A similar number do not have adequate water service, meaning sanitation and toilet facilities, clean water and clean wastewater. To say that people are talking about money and economic growth like that's a bad thing, when it is needed in the world so very much, not good. Let's talk about the costs of decarbonization. What does it mean to follow through on these policies to say, hey, let's get rid of all this naughty CO2? What does that actually mean? Okay, let's take a look at electricity. We need electricity. As a matter of fact, the more you use it, the longer you live. I'm kidding, that's not really what this indicates. But if you don't have any, you're not going to live very long. Each dot on this scatter plot is one nation on the planet. And so each dot here is one country, and we see how much electricity each person uses in the horizontal direction, and vertically, how long they live. I see a pretty clear trend here. How about making sure babies don't die? I see a very clear trend here between the availability of electricity and infant mortality. You cannot be a developed country. You cannot have good living standards. You cannot save lives if you don't have adequate electricity, if you have energy poverty. Enforcing energy poverty is murder. Enforcing energy poverty is murder, plain and simple. Let's take a look at this on country basis. Electricity use per person annually. You see the US, quite high. EU, you can see the EU level. And let's take a look at China, and let's take a look over the period from the beginning of the the opening up period of 1979, and the latest data I had, which is 2014. So electricity use per capita in China has increased by a factor of how much is this? About 12 times. That's fantastic. This is part of the reason that there are 700 to 800 million fewer people in poverty in China today than at the beginning of the reform and opening up period. This is enormous. Let's take a look at another region of the planet, Sub-Saharan Africa. The two bars here, you see on the right. On the left is the 1979 level, and on the right, the 2014 level. Barely budged. We are not going to make, as human beings, there is no way to get this number up to the level of 5,000 to 10,000 that it should be for a dignified and good standard of life if the only energy resources available to people are incredibly expensive and intermittent. If nations are told you cannot build a cheap coal plant because it's bad for the environment, you're going to have to buy some windmills. That's a form of murder. Now, I'm sympathetic to people promoting smaller power sources as a way of trying to get some development on a village level. I understand where that's coming from. Having solar in a local area is better than nothing. But if you're talking about the full development of a nation, forget it. The world as a whole, seen at night, shows this disparity in living standard potential. If, for example, the very dark region that you see there, the continent of Africa, is to be transformed over the next decades into a fully developed region, creating scientific breakthroughs that the whole world will develop from, with space programs, with leading health research, with nuclear technology being developed, that will not occur without power. So CO₂, bad for your health? Good for your health. Let's take a look at the cost of energy. This is really what we should look at here. Even though windmills have come down in price by, I think they're about a quarter of what they were a couple of decades ago. Similar decrease in price of solar panels. They've come down in price dramatically. Nonetheless, as you see here, those countries that have a greater installed capacity of wind and solar, they pay more for their power. Why? It's not because each windmill or each solar panel, when it's windy and noon, is ineffective or costly. It's because when you build up an entire system based on resources that turn on and off outside of your control, you need a huge backup infrastructure. You essentially need a whole real power system so when this other stuff isn't working, you can still maintain yourselves. As a system for a nation, that's incredibly expensive. And that's money that isn't going to something else. That's investment that then doesn't go to something else. The more of these things you build, the less value each one has because of the instability that it creates. So telling nations that they're not allowed to build cheap power plants means you're going to have less power. Overall, if the energy poverty that the world, some parts of the world are in right now, is not remedied within the next generation or two, there will be 10, 20 or more, 10 million, 20 million or more dead children who never got to speak up saying, I'd rather have coal power and have electricity in the hospital that I was born in. They won't be able to speak up and say that because they will never have been able to speak at all. This is the cost of decarbonization. Last point, nuclear. There's a reason that nuclear power is awesome, and it is that the physical process of breaking apart or putting together nuclei involves physical forces that are about 1 million times stronger than the forces between electrons that make up chemical bonds. This is why the combustion of one molecule of methane, seen on the left, compared to one fusion process, seen on the right, in this case it's deuterium and tritium, rather than the superior process that we heard about from a previous speaker. Nonetheless, 20 million times more energy per combustion, you could say, of a fusion fuel than a chemical fuel. Nuclear is the absolute way to go. And while we're getting there, we can't say In the meantime, let's not build any more coal or whatnot. We're just going to have to do this if we're going to eliminate poverty on this planet and save people's lives. I think I had showed from the beginning that the claims of extinctions, extreme weather, these are general claims that the numbers don't bear out. The supposed certainty about CO2's impact on the climate is vastly overstated. The models are lacking key physical processes that should be studied and incorporated into them. And there's a political dimension here from a movement that literally was created by Nazis and racists, literally, that I think has continued to inform the practices from the top level and the impact that these policies supposedly for the good of the people and the planet actually have on poor people and others around the world. LaRouche wrote, in general, the potential productivity of an economy is limited on the higher side by the energy density of the basic modes of energy production being used by that economy. The higher the energy density, the cheaper the energy can be in terms of social costs of producing energy, and the more abundant the energy available for expanding the economy. The step-by-step advance from a full-scale fission energy economy, that's our current nuclear plants that break apart uranium, into a fusion energy economy is the unique path of development which enables our nation and the world to increase the effective rate of capital formation into the next century and beyond. It is the only policy which leads to this successful survival of our civilization. We need to move to new, more powerful forms of energy, not go back to the 1500s and use windmills. CO2 reduction is costly, it's deadly, and it's unnecessary. Thank you.